November 18, 2020. Diego Maradona knocked on Elena Morales' door carrying two things, a briefcase full of cash and a letter that should have been burned 35 years ago. The letter was in Elena's handwriting, 3 pages describing cigarette burns on a 12-year-old's back, bruises that looked like fingerprints, a boy who begged to sleep in her classroom because home meant fists and broken bottles. She had written it to save him, but she never sent it. Now someone else had the original. Someone who knew that the hand of God belonged to a boy whose teacher had documented every scar, every cry for help. Every night she let him hide under her desk until his father sobered up. The blackmail had been bleeding Diego dry for 2 decades. Anonymous letters, photos of that original report. Always the same demand: pay or the world learns their golden God was just a broken child whose teacher knew everything and did nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's arthritic fingers trembled as she stared at the man standing in her doorway. The Diego she remembered had eyes that sparkled with mischief even when they were wet with tears. This man's eyes were clouded, distant, like looking into muddy water. Señora Morales. His voice was rough, weathered by decades of cocaine and crowd roars. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, not because she recognized him, but because something in his posture, the way he hunched his shoulders, the way he clutched that briefcase against his chest, reminded her of every broken child who had ever sought refuge in her classroom. Her apartment was a monument to decay. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing patches of moldy plaster underneath. The radiator hadn't worked in 3 winters. Books, her only remaining treasures, were stacked in precarious towers where furniture used to be, before she'd sold everything piece by piece to buy food. Diego surveyed the room without judgment. She appreciated that. "You don't remember me," he said, settling into her one remaining chair, a wooden thing with a wobbly leg that she'd kept, because it reminded her of the classroom chairs from San Patricio Elementary. "Should I?" He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed with age. Elena's breath caught. Even from across the room, she recognized her own careful handwriting on the front. Child Protective Services. Urgent. The memories crashed over her like a tide. A small boy with dirt under his fingernails and terror in his voice. "Por favor, Señora Morales. Let me stay, just until he falls asleep." "Diego Armando Franco," she whispered. "Maradona now." A bitter smile crossed his face. "Though I suppose you knew that already." She hadn't owned a television in 5 years. The radio had broken last winter. Her world had shrunk to these 4 walls, to the sound of her neighbors fighting through thin plaster, to the daily calculation of whether she had enough pesos for bread or heat, but never both. "I wrote that letter," she said, her voice barely audible. "I was going to send it, but you didn't. Your father came to see me. The night before I was supposed to mail it." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a scar from 35 years ago still showed white against her weathered skin. "He said if I reported him, he'd make sure I never taught again. He'd tell everyone I was filling children's heads with lies." Diego leaned forward, his bulk straining the small chair. "He threatened you." He did more than threaten. The words came out in a rush, decades of guilt finally finding voice. "He pushed me down the stairs outside my apartment. Said it was just a preview. Said next time it would be my face instead of my arm that broke." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing an arm that had never quite healed properly. It ached in the rain, a permanent reminder of her cowardice. "So, you kept the letter." "I was going to try again. Find another way. But then you stopped coming to school. Your family moved away and I—" She spread her hands helplessly. "I told myself you were safe somewhere else, that someone else would save you." Diego opened the briefcase. Stacks of American dollars filled every compartment. More money than Elena had seen in her entire life. Enough to buy a new apartment, to eat meat again, to turn the heat on without counting pesos. "This is for you," he said. "All of it. I don't understand. Someone has been bleeding me dry with that letter for 20 years. Every time I think it's over, another envelope arrives." more money, or the world sees how the hand of God was really just the hand of an abused child whose teacher knew the truth and stayed silent. Elena felt the walls of her small world crumbling. How did they get it? That's what I need to know. Diego's voice dropped to almost a whisper. I've paid millions, millions, but it's not about money anymore. 3 weeks ago, the demands stopped. No more requests for cash. Instead, I got this. He pulled out another envelope, this one recent. Inside was a single photograph, Diego as a boy, sleeping under her desk, curled up like a wounded animal. On the back, written in block letters, time to pay a different kind of debt. They want me to confess, publicly, to destroy my legacy, to admit that everything I accomplished came from rage, from damage. They want me to tell the world that Diego Maradona was built on the broken bones of a boy named Diego Franco. Elena stared at the photograph, remembering that night, how small he had looked, how quietly he had cried himself to sleep while she graded papers by lamplight, one ear always listening for his father's footsteps in the hallway. Who else knew? She asked. That, Diego said, is what we're going to find out. Elena's hands shook as she set the photograph on her small table. The image of young Diego curled beneath her desk, burning into her vision like a brand. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in with the weight of resurrected secrets. Through the thin plaster, she could hear Senora Vasquez next door scolding her grandson, the same rhythm of frustration that had echoed through these walls for years. I need tea, she said, more to herself than to Diego. Her routines were all she had left, the morning inventory of her meager supplies, the careful rationing of sugar cubes, the evening ritual of checking and rechecking the locks. Do you want tea? Diego nodded, though she suspected he was only being kind. She moved to her makeshift kitchen, a corner where a hot plate sat beside a cracked porcelain sink. The gas had been cut off months ago, but the hot plate still worked when the electricity cooperated. As she filled the kettle with rusty water, she caught her reflection in the blackened window. 70 years old next month, though she felt ancient. Her gray hair hung in thin wisps, and her once sturdy frame had withered to bird bones draped in loose skin. She had been beautiful once. Her students used to say she looked like the actresses in the old films, with her dark eyes and elegant posture. Miguel, her husband of 30 years, used to trace the line of her jaw with his finger and call her his Profesora Hermosa. But Miguel had been dead 8 years now, taken by a heart attack in their bed while she slept beside him, and beauty seemed like something that had happened to someone else in another lifetime. The kettle's whistle brought her back. She poured water over tea bags she had used twice already, the liquid barely amber, more memory than tea. Her movements were automatic, practiced, the same dance she performed every evening when loneliness pressed against her chest like a physical weight. I kept all their letters, she said, carrying the cups to where Diego sat. Every thank you note, every drawing. 5,000 children passed through my classroom in 42 years. She gestured toward a shoebox on her windowsill, its corners soft with age. Inside were hundreds of folded papers, drawings in crayon of stick figure teachers, notes written in careful cursive, Dear Senora Morales, thank you for helping me with my reading. You are the best teacher in the world. Simple words that had sustained her through the difficult years after Miguel's death, when the government seized her pension and left her with nothing but these fading testimonials. I remember every name, she continued, settling into her chair. Carmen Restrepo, who couldn't sit still but wrote the most beautiful poems about her grandmother's garden. Alejandro Herrera, who drew pictures of spaceships because he wanted to be an astronaut. Lucia Santos, who brought me wildflowers every Friday because she said teachers needed beauty too. Diego watched her with those clouded eyes, and she wondered what he saw. A foolish old woman clinging to irrelevant memories while the world crumbled around her, or the teacher who had once meant something to a frightened boy. But you, she said softly, you were different. You came to me broken in a way that still had sharp edges. The other children, their problems were like bruises, painful but they healed. Yours were like cuts that wouldn't stop bleeding. She reached for her own envelope among the stack beside her chair, pulling out a letter she had written just last week. The address at the top belonged to her niece in Cordoba, Elena's only living relative. She had been trying for months to find the courage to send it, a plea for help, an admission that she could no longer survive on her own. Pride had stopped her each time, the same pride that had kept her from reaching out to former colleagues or neighbors. "I write letters I don't send," she admitted, smoothing the paper with trembling fingers. "It's become a habit. Conversations with people who are too far away or too busy or too dead to answer." The irony wasn't lost on her. The letter that had destroyed Diego's peace was one she had been too afraid to send, while the letters she wrote now would be lifelines if she could only find the courage to mail them. Outside, the evening was settling into the rhythm of La Boca. Children's voices echoed from the courtyard below, and the smell of cooking oil drifted through her broken window sill. Somewhere a radio played tango, the melancholy notes weaving between the sounds of ordinary life continuing around them. "I dream about that night sometimes," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You under my desk, so small I could have hidden you in my coat pocket. I dream that I sent the letter, that someone came to save you." Diego leaned forward, his breathing labored. "But then I wouldn't have become who I am." "And who are you?" she asked, studying his face in the lamplight. Really, the question hung between them like smoke, heavy with implications neither was ready to explore. Before Diego could answer, 3 sharp knocks echoed through the apartment. Elena's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Nobody visited her. Nobody even knew she lived here except the landlord who came for rent she couldn't pay. "Are you expecting someone?" Diego's voice had changed, become alert in a way that reminded her suddenly of the hypervigilant child he'd once been, always listening for footsteps, always ready to hide. Elena shook her head, rising on unsteady legs. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Through the thin door, a woman's voice called out in accented Spanish, "Señora Morales? My name is Carmen Delacroix. I'm a journalist from France. I'd like to speak with you about Diego Maradona." The blood drained from Elena's face. Diego was already moving, faster than she would have thought possible for a man in his condition, gathering the photograph and the briefcase with practiced efficiency. But there was nowhere to hide in her tiny apartment, no back exit, no closet large enough for a grown man. "The bathroom," she whispered, but Diego was already shaking his head. "The window," he said, moving toward it. "We're on the 3rd floor. I've jumped from higher." His smile held no humor. The fire escape connects to the building next door. But as he reached for the window latch, Elena saw something that made her stomach drop. Across the narrow alley, in the window of the facing tenement, a man sat with a camera, its telephoto lens pointed directly at them. When he saw her looking, he didn't turn away. Instead, he raised one hand in a mockingly casual wave. "Diego," she whispered. He followed her gaze and went very still. The woman outside continued knocking, now accompanied by a man's voice speaking rapid French. Elena caught only fragments. "Inside, confirmed. Story breaks tomorrow." "How long have they been watching?" Diego asked, his voice barely audible. Elena thought of the past few days, the strange feeling she'd had of being observed, the man who'd lingered too long at the newsstand across the street, the woman who'd asked too many questions at the market about who lived in the old building. She'd dismissed it as paranoia, the delusions of an isolated mind. I don't know. Maybe weeks? Diego sank back into the chair, and for a moment he looked exactly as he had at 12, trapped, terrified, seeing all his hiding places disappear one by one. They knew I was coming. They knew before I knew. The woman outside had stopped knocking. Instead, Elena heard the soft scraping of metal against metal, someone working at the lock. In La Boca, where desperation had taught many people useful skills, breaking and entering was as common as breathing. "Señora Morales," the woman called again, her voice now coming from inside the hallway. "We know Diego is with you. We just want to talk." Elena's mind raced through possibilities, but every path led to the same destination: exposure, scandal, the destruction of whatever peace Diego had left. And for herself, what? Her picture in newspapers she couldn't afford to buy, her private tragedy dissected by strangers who would never understand the impossible choices teachers sometimes faced. "There's something else," Diego said suddenly, his voice strange. He pulled another envelope from his jacket. This one she hadn't seen before. Her name was written on it in handwriting she recognized but couldn't quite place. This came for you yesterday, to my house. Someone wanted to make sure you saw it before. He gestured toward the sounds in the hallway. Elena opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a copy of her unsent letter to Child Protective Services, but this version was different. Someone had written additional lines at the bottom in her exact handwriting, words she had never written. I am prepared to testify that I witnessed Diego Armando Franco's father sexually abusing him on multiple occasions in my classroom. I have photographs as evidence. The room tilted. Elena gripped the edge of the table to keep from falling. I never wrote this. There were never photographs. I would never. Someone's been planning this for a long time, Diego said quietly. The blackmail, the forged additions to your letter, the journalists arriving exactly when I'm here. They don't just want to destroy me, Elena. They want to destroy you too. The footsteps in the hallway had stopped. Elena could hear whispered voices, the soft click of camera equipment being readied. In a few moments, her door would open and her small, hidden life would explode into fragments she could never piece back together. She looked at Diego, really looked at him, and saw not the bloated, damaged superstar the world knew, but the terrified child who had trusted her with his safety. She had failed him once. She would not fail him again. There's a back way, she lied, moving toward the window, through the courtyard. But we have to move now. Some truths, she realized, were worth fighting for. Even at 70, even when you had nothing left to lose. Elena's lie hung in the air between them like incense, sweet and choking. There was no back way. The window opened onto a 3-story drop into a courtyard filled with broken bottles and rusted pipes, but Diego was already moving toward it with desperate hope, and she couldn't bear to watch that hope die in his eyes the way it had 35 years ago. Wait, she whispered, her hand on his arm. Through the door she could hear the journalists arguing in hushed tones, something about angles and lighting, about which story would sell better. Her stomach clenched. They were discussing her life like a commodity. She pressed her ear to the wall that separated her apartment from Señora Vasquez's. The old woman's television was playing a telenovela at full volume, the same melodramatic voices that echoed through the thin walls every evening at 7. Elena tapped softly, 3 short, 2 long, 3 short again. A code she and her neighbor had developed years ago when Elena's husband was dying and she needed help in the night. The television volume dropped immediately. What are you doing? Diego asked, but Elena was already moving to the small closet beside her bed. Behind her winter coat, the only coat she owned, was a section of wall that had been damaged in a flood 5 years earlier. The landlord had never repaired it properly, and the rotted wood had created a gap just large enough for a desperate person to squeeze through. Señora Vasquez, Elena whispered through the gap. I need help. Elena, what trouble have you brought to my door now? But the old woman's voice was fond. They had been neighbors for 15 years, sharing sugar and gossip in equal measure. There are people outside my door. Bad people. She heard shuffling footsteps. Then Señora Vasquez's weathered face appeared on the other side of the gap. Her eyes widened when she saw Diego behind Elena. Dios mío, is that? Please, Elena said. Can we come through? Señora Vasquez hesitated, and Elena saw something flicker across her face. Fear, but also recognition, not of Diego but of something else. Something that made the old woman's hands shake as she stepped back from the wall. I can't, she whispered. Elena, I'm sorry, but I can't. Maria, please. They already came to me. The words tumbled out in a rush. Yesterday, a man with expensive shoes and a smile that made my skin crawl. He knew things, Elena. He knew about my grandson's trouble with the police last year. He knew about the money I borrowed from the church collection. He said if I helped you, everyone would know. Elena felt the world tilt again. The man with expensive shoes. She could picture him perfectly, though she'd never seen his face. Someone who collected secrets like other people collected stamps, cataloging weaknesses and storing them for future use. What did he look like? Diego asked, pressing close to the gap in the wall. Like a banker, Señora Vasquez said, her voice small. Gray hair, gray suit. hands like he'd never done real work. But his eyes, she shuddered, like looking into a grave. Through Elena's door, the journalists had grown impatient. She heard the scrape of metal again, more aggressive this time. They would be inside within minutes. "There's something else," Senora Vasquez continued, glancing nervously toward her own door. "He left something for you." She disappeared for a moment, then pushed a small package through the gap. "Said to give it to you when the time was right." Elena unwrapped it with trembling fingers. Inside was a class photograph from 1985, her fourth-grade class at San Patricio Elementary. 28 children arranged in neat rows, their faces bright with the artificial smiles of school pictures. Her own younger self stood behind them, one hand resting on the shoulder of a small boy in the front row. Diego stared at the photograph, his breathing shallow. "That's me," he said unnecessarily. But Elena wasn't looking at him. She was staring at something else, a red X drawn across another child's face in the back row, a girl with pigtails and gap-toothed smile. "Lucia Santos," Elena breathed. The little girl who had brought wildflowers every Friday, who had written thank-you notes in careful cursive, who had disappeared from school one day in the middle of October and never come back. "You remember her?" Diego asked. "I remember all of them." But as she said it, Elena realized that wasn't quite true. There were gaps in her memory, spaces where children's faces should be, but weren't. Had Lucia really disappeared? Or had Elena simply forgotten, the way teachers sometimes did when children moved away or transferred schools? The lock clicked open. Footsteps entered her apartment, moving with confident familiarity. "Senora Morales?" The woman's voice was closer now, just on the other side of Elena's bedroom door. "We know you're here. We just want to help you tell your story." Through the gap in the wall, Senora Vasquez's face was pale with terror. She mounted a single word, "Run," but there was nowhere left to run.